courts which do a better job of issuing decisions that follow the law and which seem to be cleaner and less corrupt. It's partly a rich area, poor area discussion. It's also partly a question of the level of the court. The reason that large cases involving foreign interests get brought at the high court level, or at least the intermediate court level, is those are seen as being better and fairer courts, and the data seems to be there to back it up. Local protectionism gets worse as you go down the chain to smaller and poorer areas. And we're seeing foreign courts start to take this attitude as well. There are a lot of foreign non-convenience cases involving Chinese parties in U.S. courts. That is, the plaintiff brings the case in the U.S., the defendant wants it sent back to China. The degree to which a U.S. court will send the case back to China, where it's a case that could be brought either place, is highly dependent on what kind of picture one can paint of the Chinese court in question. And so if it's going to be the High People's Court in Beijing or Guangdong or something, it's a very different world from sending it out someplace else. And indeed, we have what I think is the first case, documented anyway that I'm aware of a High People's Court or any People's Court judgment in China being enforced by a United States court. So there is a recognition of a quality of justice there that would have been unimaginable a while ago. Self-advertised when I was the expert witness in that case. We're very happy about it. Anyway, the other issue that you go, and people in this room know far more about this than I do, if you go and you look at business perceptions, there does seem to be a sense that if you're in the Gold Coast area, things look a bit better. Frustrations to be sure, but it is worth paying for expensive legal services to make sure your project is at least not on the wrong side of the law. As some people I've talked to in this doing some research in this area said, having the law on your side may not be sufficient, but it's become increasingly necessary. You don't want to be on the wrong side. Guanxi is good, but it's not enough anymore. I even had one lawyer say it's malpractice to say rely on Guanxi. All right. How do you explain the regional gap? Well, the answers are fairly familiar ones. Economic development has a lot to do with it. The degree to which the economy is marketized seems to have a lot to do with it. The degree of engagement with the outside world, the presence of foreign investors and foreign scrutiny matters. So too in the more developed areas, there's more scrutiny from the media and from higher level officials who worry more about these things. And quite simply, the diversification of the economy, the idea that you are not dealing with a company town where there is one enterprise deeply entangled with the local state, the main provider of tax revenues and employment, so you can get out of that situation, get out of a place like Tianjin, and get up to a place like Shanghai, it certainly helps. There's also been some interesting World Bank work that suggests that some of the second and third tier cities, the Xi'ans and the Chengdus, have been able to compete partly on cost, but also partly on being compared to other relatively low-cost areas, better on institutional, including legal infrastructure. And the places that have not been able to compete on that ground have not been able to grow or attract either domestic or foreign investment, despite some pretty considerable tax and other incentives to move inland. Let me now turn to be a little more forward-looking here as I start to run out of time and talk about what the prospects look like going forward. Well, I've told you a story that the glass is at least half full, and hopefully it's half full of something other than melamine-tainted milk. But the glass is at least half full, or maybe headed toward half full, certainly compared to the baseline with that before. And if you project those trend lines out, it can be relatively optimistic. But let me suggest a few other reasons to think that there is some momentum behind the development of something that more nearly approaches rule of law. First, the commitment to law has been largely a top-down phenomenon in China, but it's been a serious top-down phenomenon. There are good self-interested, or at least deeply held instrumental reasons to have pursued a somewhat greater role for law. Law has been a principal, arguably the principal vehicle for articulating and implementing the major reform policies of the last generation: market orientation, international openness, Secondly, law has been seen increasingly as an important way of checking or reining in some of the market economy and development threatening bad behavior. Corruption, rent-seeking, just all sorts of behaviors that still go on, but that are seen as threatening to agendas that the regime very much wants to pursue. And increasingly, particularly if you look at things like the poor response to various emergencies, be it SARS or the snowfall or various kinds of unrest, there's a sense that the party state has a discipline problem. It has lower level, its brain can't control its hands very well, I guess is one way of putting it. And the law can serve as part of that neural network, right, with bringing pressure from below or creating stronger means for control from above to keep the agents of the party state from going too far off the track. I would say thirdly, there is a view fairly widely held among people who think relatively deeply about this in China, that law may help substitute or preempt pressures for democracy. That you can, through legal means, whether it be administrative litigation suits or letters and visits that invoke legal norms even if they don't litigate them, you can monitor bad behavior, you can provide a steam valve, you can provide a form of input to check some of the worst policy mistakes and some of the worst implementation mistakes in a way that does not give people institutionalized rights to choose their rulers and to make the rules. And so in that sense, law is seen as a nice substitute for democratization. And the two gentlemen on this, at either extreme of this slide here, are the two sides of that debate among policy-influential intellectuals in Beijing. Down at the bottom is Conway, who argues for a consultative rule of law as an alternative to democracy. And up at the top, you probably can't see it with the picture, but it says, 民主是个好东西. Democracy is a good thing. That's Yu Ping, who is a Central Party School translator in theory, but frankly a political advisor to Wu Zhao, who says you do need democracy to back up some of these things, although we can talk about what that democracy might look like. Corruption is perhaps the best illustration of the phenomenon, the problem I've been talking about, the risk that bad behavior, unlawful behavior, will really erode trust in the regime and erode the ability to achieve economic goals. I think is quite significant. Here we have the Rogues Gallery. We have Chen Shitong, the late lamented mayor of Beijing. We have Chen Liangyu, who ran off the pension fund in Shanghai. Well, misinvested it, to be fair. And then the particularly sad-looking fellow down at the bottom, Zheng Xiaoliu, the corrupt head of the State Food and Drug Administration, who was sentenced to death for taking bribes to approve drugs. These are all seen as potentially existential threats that can be dealt with by a stronger, to some degree, by a stronger legal system. People like He Minxin estimate the direct costs of corruption maybe 2 to 3% of GDP. Hu Angan famously estimates the indirect cost of corruption may run up to 16% of GDP. These give you good reasons to think about how to deal with these, and I gave you relatively positive ranks for China on rule of law. The ranks on corruption are much lower. And so this suggests the kind of gap where law may be part of the perceived answer to the solution. The Pew survey on popular attitudes in China is also striking in this regard. 78% of Chinese, and this is mostly urban, affluent Chinese surveyed, say corruption is a problem. 39% say it's a big problem. There's nothing else that scores that high on the list of things people are worried about. So that's just one illustration. There's another bar graph that has China well below the median for the East Asian comparators and the large economy comparators. Let me suggest, as I'm running out of time here, let me suggest other things that suggest a relatively hopeful trajectory for law here. There are, in a way that was not true not too long ago, constituencies that support greater legality. Some of this is the regime has been saying long enough that it's serious about law, that it has now staked part of its legitimacy on doing reasonably decently on the legal front. You can't abandon that project without severe cost, and there's a reluctance to try to back away from it. There are now people with good self-interested personal and professional reasons to support something more like a rule of law. There are judges, there are lawyers, there are academics, there are commentators, there are public intellectuals. There are lots of people who benefit from a law mattering more, and they've created some space where some legal gadflies, if you will, have taken up the call and pushed even further towards stronger reforms. And so you get now, in a way that wasn't true not too long ago, a serious discussion about concrete institutional reforms that could strengthen legality. Let me take a couple of examples from the court side of things. He Leifang, who recently got himself in some trouble at Zhejiang University and various other things. But anyway, he's been out there arguing for a while now, and others are going to say what China needs is judicial budgets being separated from local government processes, a centralized budget to avoid local protectionism. Judges' promotions being based on evaluations by superiors rather than a diffuse sort of more party-based system, and perhaps